Welcome to The Writer Reads Nurse, a short, dark urban fantasy story. This is part one of two. The nurse stood at the edge of the bed and glanced at her patient. She took the young man's hand and began to bandage his mangled finger. It was the least gruesome injury she'd seen that day, and he was her last patient. It had been a long and particularly busy day, and the nurse was looking forward to the end of a long shift. Her name tag called her Allison. The hospital records knew her as Allison Glaze. Allison didn't ask what had bitten his finger, although it was obvious that a bite had caused the damage. That question had already been asked, and the details he'd given had been sketchy at best. Triage suspected a spider bite and placed him under observation while other more life-threatening injuries were treated ahead of him. Looking at the injury again, the nurse had her doubts. While the injury looked like a spider bite, there was more damage than seemed possible from a mere spider. As she bandaged, Allison studied the hand she held. It was a strong hand, a working hand. There were calluses on the fingertips and across the top of the palm, not hard, horny calluses that felt like warts, but smooth, stone-like calluses that were covered by layers of tough yet supple skin. The nurse glanced at her patient's face. The clipboard on the end of the bed named him Oliver Stone. He was lying on the bed with his eyes closed. His skin was clammy and sheened in a light layer of sweat, but he ran no fever. He opened his eyes when she paused in her bandaging. They were grey, although she could have sworn they were grey, although she could have sworn they'd been blue when he'd first walked in. Oliver returned her inspection and smiled briefly at her. For a moment his eyes were almost blue again. Almost. Then he closed them once more, a faint smile lingering on his face. His smile made Allison wonder what he had seen in her. She was pretty enough, having inherited her mother's fine features and long dark hair, but she wasn't that pretty. They hadn't spoken, so he couldn't be smiling at anything she'd said. Allison continued bandaging, watching the wound disappear beneath its cotton pad and the narrow bandage's crepe binding. Glancing at Oliver once more, she noted the pallor of his skin and decided to recommend an overnight stay. Well, Oliver, she thought, careful to stop the overlapping tones from creasing, you've done a proper job here. The bite was a strange one, a spider bite, as the report said, but unlike any bite she'd seen. Allison pondered it as she worked. The injury was more like a laceration inflicted by two fragments of old metal, deep and jagged and nasty, probably prone to infection. Because Oliver had not been able to describe what kind of spider had bitten him, save that it had been overly large and a polished grey in colour, the hospital had admitted him for observation. With Allison's notes, they'd extended that to overnight. If he improved, Oliver would leave in the morning. The more she thought about it, the more Allison thought the injury looked like a cut sustained in outdoor work. Barbed wire, maybe, or a careless slice from some piece of machinery. If it hadn't been for the parallel puncture marks and Oliver's report, she wouldn't have seriously considered it a spider, not even a large one, although it did look like a bite in spite of that. A hungry tractor, perhaps? Allison frowned. She'd almost finished the bandaging, with little more to do than fasten the clip across its folds, when she noticed an increasing warmth in the hand in her grasp. Securing the clip, she looked down at her patient. The faint smile was gone from Oliver's face. The bronze of his tan now tinged a yellowy green. When she laid his hand across his chest, he didn't stir, nor did he respond to her voice. Allison reached for a thermometer. His temperature wasn't easy to take, and when she tried to rouse him again, Oliver still didn't respond. Allison's concern grew when she saw the thermometer reading. She made a note of his temperature on the chart at the bottom of his bed and crossed to the door of the room. There was no one in the corridor. She looked back at her patient, hating to leave him alone. He hadn't moved. The hand she had laid across his chest still rested there. His eyes were still closed and his face still looked toward the ceiling, although now it seemed greyer than before. Allison hurried out into the corridor. She was going to need some assistance. As the sound of her steps receded down the hall, Oliver opened his eyes. They were no longer grey. They were blue again, with silver threads reflecting the fluorescence in the ceiling. His finger throbbed. His hand, his arm, they all throbbed. He glanced down at the roll of bandage encasing the bite. He glanced around for the nurse and saw no one. His clothes rubbed uncomfortably against his skin whose colour was rapidly turning to yellowed iron, its texture changing from flesh to marble. Oliver's head pounded and his mouth felt dry, but there was no water on the night table beside the bed. When he tried to sit up, his body felt like lead, his arms as helpful as blocks of wood. Resigning himself to being uncomfortable until the nurse returned, he left his clothes on. Closing his eyes again, he let the fever rage. It wasn't like he could do anything else. Fire ran up his arm, burning along muscle and through nerves. Synapses mutated beneath his skin. New glands formed beneath his arms, in his groin, under his chin. As the poison mutated his very DNA, his body exuded the scent of one newly born, and he screamed, although no sound escaped his lips. His calls were loud, for all that no human could hear them. They echoed down the hospital corridors and filtered through the doors of the outpatients' watch. Whoops. And filtered through the doors of the outpatients' ward until they reached the mind of one who could hear them, and he was forced to stop. In spite of the fact that he had no other business to attend to, that one knew better than to ignore the summons of someone newly made. Sending thoughts of reassurance, he looked around, noted the emergency entrance to the hospital, and hurried inside. Distracting the nurse on duty was easy, a matter of slipping into an untended room and pulling the cords out of the monitors. When she had run from behind the desk, the intruder followed the scent of pheromones and the faint keening still emanating from the youngling's mind, until he reached the ward where the youngling lay. Unfortunately, he was not alone. Another nurse stood beside the bed, explaining to a doctor that her patient had developed a sudden fever and his skin tone looked unhealthy. They looked down at the young man in the bed, discussing how the nurse needed to be more careful in her diagnosis in future. There simply was no fever. The one who had answered the youngster's unvoiced calls recognized the man lying in the bed. So, he thought, she has struck again. He examined the new addition to his Queen's collection and felt admiration. Her Majesty had excellent taste. This one was as tall as he was, but more heavily muscled. He'd make a good soldier, and heavens knew they would never have enough of those. Taste. He thought about the irony and stifled a laugh. All the doctor saw when he turned was a tall man smiling at the door. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. The smile on the tall man's face disappeared. "I've come to collect my brother," he replied. "I was waiting, but he was kept so long I began to worry." The doctor looked embarrassed. "It seemed the nurse was concerned about the bite," he said. "We checked it. There's nothing wrong with it, but overnight observation was advised because the spider couldn't be identified. He can leave, but the dressing needs to be changed once a week until it's healed." The tall man nodded. Unspoken in the doctor's voice was the need for the young man's bed. The outpatients' ward had been full when he'd passed. The nurse looked up from the patient on the bed. The tall man could see that she was confused. She knew she'd seen something, but the proof had fled her. He made a note to deal with her later. "Better still," he amended. "I'll have the young one deal with her. A lesson on carelessness." With a thought, he ordered Oliver out of bed and suggested the nurse might like to meet him on a more casual basis. The youngster obeyed, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed and nodding his thanks to the nurse. Allison said nothing, but took Oliver's shoes out of the closet and handed them to him. "Thank you." "Thank you," the youngster said, pulling them on. When he was done, he stood and headed for the door. Halfway there, he hesitated, and as if the thought had only just occurred to him, turned toward her. "How about dinner?" The nurse blushed. She looked at the doctor, but he only smiled and shrugged. "It's up to you," he said. I don't think so," the nurse replied, smiling to soften her rebuttal. "It wouldn't be wise." Well, she has that right, the tall man thought. Oliver looked disappointed. The tall man thought furiously. A buzzer rang, and the doctor turned to the nurse. "Nurse," he said, and there was a command within his voice. She hurried from the room, and the doctor looked at the two men. "Come in next week and have that dressing changed," he ordered, before disappearing in the nurse's wake. The tall man turned to his Queen's newest recruit. "My name is William," he said, "and there is much for you to learn." Oliver nodded. William sensed the first small prickle of confusion shiver through Oliver's mind, catching the first wave of doubt so common to the new. The nurse would have to wait. The young one needed to adjust, to learn, to adapt to his new form, and accept what he had become and would grow to be. William led him from the hospital and into the night. Neither returned until long after the dressings had ceased needing to be changed. Nurse Allison's memory of the young man had faded by then, and he returned alone. His superiors said he had only one thing left to mend, a mistake that had almost led to the discovery of his kindred. Almost. The change had passed, and the fever faded, leaving him looking the same as when he'd first arrived. Nearly the same. Allison's misfortune had been to return in time to see the last of the marble fade from his skin. The doctor was lucky. Allison had blocked his view. Oliver watched the hospital. He watched the nurse come and go.